Welcome to the Essentially You podcast. Erica Ziel, how are you doing today, girl?
So good. I'm so excited to get to chat with you today.
I know. I feel like this conversation has been long standing, and so many of my community members are struggling with pelvic health issues and don't know where to turn. And I wanted, before we dive into the nitty gritty of how our pelvic health affects our overall health, no surprise here, just think about where it is on our body and how it's so interconnected to everything, especially us as women. But before we get into all of that, I would love for you to speak into like what was the impetus? What was the driver that had you want to be an advocate for women for pelvic health issues?
So I love talking about this because I like to say that the pelvic floor found me. I didn't actually go searching for it. I mean, my background is in exercise science and, I studied the body, very in depth in college, and we didn't learn about the pelvic floor through all the anatomy that I took, which is quite shocking, right? When you really stop to think about that. And so kind of long story short, right, as I had always had an interest in prenatal exercise, even back in college. It was very fascinating, just the body, right? What our body could do during pregnancy. And then after having three babies of my own and working with just a variety of women, not just pregnant women, but that was part of the population that I loved working with. I just started to explore so much more about the body, the deep core fascia, and really looked outside the box instead of just staying within like formal education, which is where I started, and then studied Pilates. And I did that, which I was like, was a whole nother degree on its own, it felt like. But then it was really more about me just starting to read more books and looking in other areas outside of fitness specifically to really start to discover like, wow, the power that is our pelvic floor, and fascia plays a huge role in all of that. And it's just really been kind of one foot in front of the other. And when I created my core rehab program like 5-ish years ago, probably a little bit more now, and it was actually designed to help women recover and heal from diastasis recti. But amongst doing that, I started having all the women that were going through like, Erica, I've stopped peeing my pants, my back pain is gone, all these things. And I started to really recognize the power that is our pelvic floor. And I was like, wow, we can't talk about diastasis recti. We can't talk about back pain, knee pain, any other pain in the body. And of course, there's the pelvic floor dysfunction, right? Which really is like a silent conversation. And no one talks about it, or can't say nobody. Very few people talk about it. It's getting talked about more. And so that's really what exposed it to me when I started having women confide in me like, oh my gosh, Erica, I thought peeing your pants was normal. I thought it was okay. I thought it was just something that happened. Again, it typically comes up in the conversation after having babies, but you don't have to have babies to have pelvic floor dysfunction. So that's kind of where it all evolved from. So now I talk about it all the time.
I love it. I'm so glad. Let's talk. I mean, clearly having babies can absolutely cause some pelvic floor dysfunction and weakness or spasticity, one way or the other. I know for me, after having my baby, initially I thought everything was all good, and then no, it was not. Can we talk a little bit about, besides the having babies and how that can shift and change your pelvic floor, what are some other root causes for why we struggle with pelvic pain? Because I know it's like 600 million women around the world have pelvic pain issues.
Yeah, so I actually see a lot of women have too tight of pelvic floors. And maybe it's a little bit because I've been in the fitness world, so I tend to have a lot of women and moms that come to me because they love to work out. They want to keep doing their running and their high intensity training. But again, they're dealing with the incontinence and other aches and pains and things like that. And ultimately, what I really end up having to teach them a lot is we actually have to learn how to release and relax and let go, because by being too tight in our pelvic floor, and it's not just our pelvic floor, we also have to really understand, like we have to look at the function of our pelvis as a whole, how our, hamstrings, inner thighs, what's that correlation? Because you'll see a lot of women, they might be really tight on like the right side of their pelvic floor, the right inside of their hip and inner thigh and inner hamstring on one side. And the other side actually could be weak, or it could still be tight, right? So we're understanding that we have this right side of our body and the left side of our body. And if one side is really overcompensating, it's telling me that there's a reason, right? Something else on the other side isn't active enough. And why is that? And so a lot of it really stems from like what's going on with our pelvis. So I see this a lot in women who love their crazy workouts, right? Their high intensity workouts. And then the other end of the spectrum is we do see actual pelvic floor weakness in women who maybe are more sedentary. Maybe there's a little bit of a genetic predisposition as well, but I'm of the belief that we really can truly like heal our body when we start to learn about our body.
I love that. Yes, I agree. And I think so many women listening to this right now are thinking to themselves, including myself. I'm like, oh my goodness, yes, my piriformis is hurting. There's a tightness in the front with the psoas, like all of it just feels off. Yeah, we can all relate to there being tightness on one side or the other. And even when our hips are tight or our hamstrings are tight or whatever that may be, that I don't think we always put together that it could relate to our pelvic floor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you mentioned like the piriformis, the psoas. So I talk a lot and teach a lot about how to lengthen and release through our, not just the psoas muscle, but the psoas line fascially. So we have to, in my opinion, this is what I teach, is we have to stop looking at the body and individual muscles. And we have to look at more as a whole, right? And so can I talk a little bit about fascia? Are you okay? Like, because I
Yeah,
feel like I
I
mentioned
was gonna
it.
have you dive into
Okay.
fascia. I think we kind of have a sense of what fascia is. We don't realize that fascia could be playing a massive role on why we can't move anymore, like so yes, please, let's talk about fascia.
Okay. I was like, well, I keep mentioning it. And I know women are like, but okay, I've heard that word, but what does it mean exactly? So to really understand fascia, I like to explain it as like, it's really what connects everything in the body. It wraps around our muscles, it goes through our muscles, it wraps around our nerves, which is really, really important and to understand because we have a lot of power on getting rid of impingements and things that can be going on in the body. And so like, if you were to take off just kind of the outer layer of fascia in a body, it would lay out the whole body, right? The head, all the way to the fingers, the toes, the whole thing. So it's really important to understand, like, if we have a tight psoas line, which is that muscle, right, that runs from the front of the hip through to the inside of the upper lower back, right? And so that muscle can kind of get blamed for a lot of tightness. Well, the questions we have to start asking, well, why is it tight, right? So if the right side of your body, ladies, especially through like the pelvis, psoas, inner thigh line, all that can be really tight, your pelvic floor is probably really tight on that side. So we have to ask, well, what's going on the other side, right? And we may have pain on the right side, but many times it's because there may be dysfunction actually on the opposite side. So we get these zigzags through the body. And this is a really cool thing to think about of like, okay, we can have pelvic floor dysfunction going on, and maybe it's actually related to our pelvis, but maybe it's more so because we're overcompensating with the opposite shoulder, or we're really restricted through our rib cage and our breathing. And like breath plays a huge role in just being stuck and stagnant through our body. So that's why I love breath work, because breath work is so powerful with helping us understand our pelvic floor. It helps us learn to release and relax. It also is a big, powerful tool to actually learn how to properly strengthen our pelvic floor.
Now, when you're talking about fascia, I just want to go back to fascia for
Yeah.
just a second, because I know it's kind of like you said, it literally coding everything. And I think so often what happened over time, especially for women, is that it just gets stuck. It can absolutely entrap your, I go to the chiropractor and my ART specialist every week to detrap my median nerve because of because of my baby arm. And so so I start to get tingling and numbness in my index finger and my thumb. That's usually within 7 days that it comes back in. And then he goes in and he strips, or he basically releases the median nerve from my fascia and my muscles. And so that's very much the case. I find, I don't know how easy it is to move and kind of release fascia inside of the leg. I would guess, especially around the pelvic floor, that it's not easy. But basically, a lot of our lack of movement is because our fascia is getting bound up. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's definitely a big part of it. It's because we've got we've got tightness one area of our body, which then leads to overcompensation in other areas. And that's where we start to get pain and dysfunction. And that's where this whole conversation about understanding fascia and pelvic floor dysfunction really starts to happen. And, I get women who like have low back pain, and I'm like, okay, well, we have to understand what's going on with your pelvis and your pelvic floor. And many times they almost like, your mind wants to kind of fight it because we've been so ingrained, indoctrinated. Oh, you have back pain, it's coming from your back. I find that to be very rare, actually. Like most women's back pain is not actually from their back. It's where they feel the pain. But unless you've had an accident where it was actually something severely happened to the spinal column, then, outside of that, it's typically because there's imbalances going on and how we're activating. And then what is our fascia doing? And a lot of women, right, tend to have that like really tucked booty because they've been taught to do that in their workout classes. Like, tuck your booty and tuck it harder. And that is actually can really lead to really tight fascia through our pelvis. It leads to that psoas tightness, and it's putting pressure on your back, and it's actually shutting off your pelvic floor. So posture plays a huge role in all of this as well.
Hmm. It's a lot. Yes, it's a lot to think about. No one's ever taught us the importance of posture or of how we position our bodies during workouts, or potentially needing physical therapy after a birth. A lot of this just gets kind of pushed to the wayside. So let's talk a little bit about, I know a big part of this is focusing on our deep core and caring for that. Is this a good first start for us?
I think the biggest thing is to start to just bring awareness to how we're holding our body and really what our deep core is, which is where, pelvic floor is the base of our deep core. So many times when we talk about core, we think like ab exercises, right? So when I'm talking about our deep core, what I'm really talking about is from the base of our pelvis, our pelvic floor, through our abdominal wall, and then also the deep layers of the musculature and fascia of the around the spine and the spinal column, all the way up to our diaphragm and the rib cage and up underneath our shoulders. So we really start to understand that there's so much more to strengthening our core than just doing quote abdominal exercises. So in order to really properly, strengthen our deep core, we've got to bring awareness to what our pelvic floor is doing, because traditional ab exercises actually put a lot of pressure on our pelvic floor, shut it off. And so it's actually leading to more dysfunction and weakness than learning how to properly activate and then do correct core exercises, which really honestly is something that you are basically doing with any sort of movement, right? Whether you're standing, you're walking, you are running, you're doing your squats, you're doing your planks, you're doing all sorts of movement all the time. But thinking about like, oh, how are we actually, activating our pelvic floor, the deep core muscles? How are we holding our body? Because if we think about it, right, just the simplistic of our posture, and we sit so much anymore, right? Or looking at our phones, right? And we tend to get this roundedness and this shortness through our spine. And the more that we do that throughout our day, that's where our fascia is going to form. So that's going to be short and it's going to keep pulling us down. But we have the power with just awareness of how we're holding our body, how we're breathing, what is our pelvic floor doing, of like, oh, we can actually improve that just throughout our daily movement versus thinking like we have to have a specific structured, crazy movement workout all the time to do this. It's something we actually learn to do and weave it in to our daily life as well as our movement practice.
Yeah, I think that would be like, that's a very new, novel concept. I think a lot of us think that it's Kegels that we've got to be doing.
Yes. Yes. Would you like me to
Like
explain?
a specific exercise for pelvic floor. This is what I do for my 5 minutes every evening. You don't think about it being interwoven into your daily activities. You think of like, here's my pelvic floor exercise. But I know that Kegels can cause harm, can be not only done incorrectly, but can cause harm over time too. And
Yeah.
I know that people don't know why that is.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So the reason I don't promote Kegels is because we've really been taught to do them by like the stopping the flow of urine, right? When we go pee, right? And that's actually, I believe, is a really horrible thing to do because it's could be leading to buildup back up in our bladder, right? Anyone who's had a UTI knows that that is not fun. I've personally had them too, not from doing that. It was from a really bad habit of training clients back to back and not allowing myself enough break, right? So don't do that either. I just think that we need to be not doing that. Plus, if we are just focusing on the Kegel, it really only focuses more on the front of the pelvic floor. And something I always like to really get women to understand is our pelvic floor is much bigger than how we think of it. Because most women think it's like a quarter size, right? It's actually this big diamond. So if you're watching a video, hold my fingers up. I like to use a diamond example of that. It's running from our pubic bone, right? The front of the pelvis, all the way to the tailbone, and then sits bone to sits bone. So those of you listening and sitting, if you're sitting on something, kind of just like wiggle around on your pelvis, and you'll feel like, oh, there's the sits bones, there's the pubic bone, there's the tailbone. Understand that that is our pelvic floor. And there's, different muscles through there, but it's all the pelvic floor musculature. And while the muscles themselves are fairly thin, we have layers of fascia, and we have fascia above our pelvic floor muscle, which is what actually helps to support our organs. And this is why I get really excited about this, because when we start to understand that we can then strengthen the fascia of our pelvic floor and our deep core, we actually are then learning how to strengthen and hold our organs up more effectively so that we can prevent incontinence. We can reverse incontinence. We can prevent and help to minimize and reverse pelvic organ prolapsing, right? Which is something most women don't even realize can happen until it happens to them. It is preventable. And we can, at least if it has happened, we can do a lot of work to minimize symptoms. So we have to really understand and get out of this mindset of not doing Kegels because of how it can overgrip and create, I talked about like the right side of the pelvic floor and the left side of the pelvic floor. It can create huge imbalance in the pelvic floor. And so a lot of women, when they're doing their Kegels, they'll actually clench their glute muscles because they think that that's actually them activating their pelvic floor. But ladies, if you're doing that, you're actually shutting off your pelvic floor. So we need to learn how to activate our pelvic floor independently, yes, but we also need to learn how to activate our pelvic floor and connect through our entire deep core as one, because that's actually where we get the best pelvic floor activation. You ultimately cannot just get the best pelvic floor activation just working your pelvic floor alone. It really is working it as a whole, this whole deep core capsule. And that's where like breath work plays a huge role, and understanding that, hey, it's all connected really through fascia. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, no, and I agree. It's all interconnected. And so is it thinking about how to protect it and stabilize our pelvic core muscles, not overactivate or underactivate, right? And I know that the left and the right side come into play as well. Are there things that we are doing when we're sitting? Is it how we're walking? If it's not like a little exercise regimen, I think so many of us are used to a prescription, of things to do. What is it? What are some things that we can do if we know if we're sneezing or laughing too hard and we do pee a little, right? If things are painful, just we just know things are tight and uncomfortable. Like, so I think so often women have, pelvic floor concerns and they don't necessarily know it. They're not connecting the dots. But for those of us who definitely know something's going on, what are some types of things that we can do that can help kind of create more stability there?
Okay, so I want to address the one comment you said about how not all women really understand if they have pelvic floor dysfunction. So I'll first say that if you have diastasis recti, if you have back pain, hip pain, knee pain, neck pain, shoulder pain, stuff like that, I would say that you should learn a lot more about your pelvic floor, because there's a really, really high chance that there is some pelvic floor dysfunction going on. You just aren't having symptoms yet. Because I will address that when I'm teaching on my students how to get rid of back pain. We have to go to the pelvic floor. Like, it just is a part of the conversation. But as far as like things to be aware, right? So you mentioned sneezing. So let me just kind of explain this with everybody, is that in order to, get a better pelvic floor activation, having that visual of that diamond at the base of your pelvis, I find to be very, very helpful for women. Because they're like, oh, it's a lot bigger than I thought. So we can start to visualize those 4 points lightly coming together, and then we're like zipping up from the base of the pelvis, front of the pubic bone, all the way through the top of the head. So like it's involving our pelvic floor as well as our entire torso. So it'll instantly improve your posture because you're like, oh, well, I have to lengthen up, right? I've got to zip up. And you want to do it in a really gentle way, right? So that's the other thing is if you notice yourself holding your breath or you're really trying to activate your core because you're so used to doing lots of ab exercises, like you have to stop doing that. So sometimes just doing a little bit of taking a deep inhale and just visualizing your pelvic floor relaxing and then very lightly activating, just like even like 25%. And so if you start to feel a sneeze coming on or a cough or you're laughing, like take that second to like exhale and connect with the pelvic floor before you do that. And I say pelvic floor and really your deep core as a whole, and it really can help prevent that. And as well as like, sitting during the day. So if we're sitting and we're sitting a lot with like a tucked booty and we've got a chair with a back or we're at home working on our couch or things like that, just that seated position, ladies, is putting a lot of pressure on your pelvic floor and it can lead to incontinence. Even myself, if I catch myself being lazy one day and I'm like, I want to work on my couch for a couple hours, I like totally regret it later because I just feel it in my body and I can always tell that, it just it wasn't good for my body. So those are really simple things, and even walking. And so this is where it comes down. And this is why I have my free pelvic floor guide that I created, because I know a lot of women listening are like, Erica, okay, so I hear you, but I'm not feeling anything that you're telling me to say. So this is a really important thing to talk about and mention, because I've worked with thousands of women now to date that have gone through my program to really learn the moves and the breath work and all the mindfulness that goes along with this, is that it is very normal that you do not feel it in the beginning. Like it can take a while. It could take several weeks for a woman to really start to actually correctly wake up her pelvic floor. And so we have to get out of this mindset of like, we have to go harder to feel it. We actually have to do the opposite. And like I said, if you're someone who likes to run and lift heavy weights and do, intense workout, that's fine. But we actually have to get out of that mindset of like the kind of go hard or go home. This is like the opposite. This is finding all these deep layers of connections and activation that you're never going to get by just working out harder and more intense. So this is like the opposite. This is like the gentle activation of strengthening our body, which when you slow down to learn these techniques that I teach, you will actually down the road, as you work back in your high intensity exercise, you'll be stronger and faster. And it's absolutely amazing. I even find that with like moms that have had like 5, 6 babies. I love those stories because they're like, Erica, oh my gosh, I trusted you. I trusted the process. I slowed down, really learned how to re-strengthen my pelvic floor, my core, and I'm back to running, and I'm running faster and with no pain, no pee in my pants than I did before having my 5 children, right? So it is really amazing. Our body has this incredible innate ability to heal and get stronger than we've ever been. We just many times have to kind of get our ego brain out of the way and tell ourselves that like, no, it's okay to actually slow down and really take care of our body so that then we can speed up down the road.
I think this is like such an eye-opening conversation because again, number one, a lot of women don't necessarily realize that there is a concern around their pelvic floor. They're not connecting the dots, mainly because we're not helping them to do so. So I'm so grateful for this conversation. And then two, if we do feel like we have, a situation like we're having pain or we're having incontinence or, whatever that may be, that we're like overdoing it. When is there a time, Erica, honey, to get involved with a pelvic floor specialist?
So I definitely think if someone's dealing with pelvic organ prolapse, where you feel, typically women will say like they feel like a bulge coming out, right, of their vagina, definitely a great time to go see a physical therapist or a pelvic floor physical therapist. I think it's never a bad time. It can be good just to go and get an evaluation to see like, oh, wow, how am I connecting with my pelvic floor, right? And so I never discourage anyone from going to a pelvic floor physical therapist. That said, I also think that to complement that, it's really important to learn the actual techniques and the movements, the breath work, the mindfulness techniques of how to apply it to basically the whole movement and applying it to your life so that we're really rebalancing your whole body, your posture, and whatever other, misalignment kind of things that have happened, because none of us like has perfect alignment, right? And it's not about perfect alignment either. It's really about getting us out of pain and dysfunction. That's like my big goal for women, so they can get back to living the life that they desire and keeping up with their kids and, going for runs if they want to, whatever it is that they really desire and want to do. I want to help get them there. But many times it means kind of slowing down to then speed up.
Well, isn't that a great lesson for us all the time? in everything we do.
Slow down.
There's a take home message. Your pelvic floor is asking you to slow down, and a lot of other parts of your body too, for sure. Erica, honey, your guide, I cannot wait to get my hands on it. And we're going to have it in the show notes for this episode as well. But before we talk a little bit about where to find you, I would love to do a couple our quick fire questions. Are you down?
Okay, let's do it.
Yay. Okay. So here are 5 and we'll make it quick and snappy. The first one is, what is the one thing you're deeply grateful for right now?
My family.
Love that. What was something you've done that made you feel extremely happy in this last week?
Going outside for walks in nature in the trees. One of my favorite things.
Me too. That just makes me happy just hearing it. What's one thing about you that surprises people?
That I grew up on a farm helping to raise cattle and played in the mud and the manure and all of that.
Yes. Did your kids ever get a chance to go check that out?
Well, by the time I had kids, my dad was pretty much done with the cattle side of things. He still farms a little bit. So and we live on like a couple acres with trees and a pond. So we kind of have not extreme farm life right now, but they get some nature, which is a huge thing for me.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Not the manure life, but definitely your life. Got it. Okay. So what book or film has recently had a big impact on you and why?
Oh, we watched this summer. What was it called? I think it was called The Biggest Little Farm. And it was like a documentary about basically building a self-sustainable kind of, I think more up in kind of just above LA County, somewhere up there. And it was really fun. We watched it as a family. And so again, kind of, I think it's the farming roots in it, right? They're showing, animals being born and just the whole ecosystem up there. And it just moved me to remind me like how amazing just nature really is.
I love that tie-in. And then the last question is, knowing what you know now, Erica, what is the best advice you would have given your 18-year-old self?
I wish I could have given myself at 18 the education that I now teach women about. I would say specifically what comes up is like understanding, I would say birth even more, and all of that, like preparing for and recovery. Because I had a little bit with my first, but nothing like I now teach my students, which can have a profound effect on how her birth goes, as well as her recovery postpartum. But at the same time, I look back and each of my experiences probably also led to me doing what I am doing today. So.
I love that. But yeah, that's so critical. Like I wish so much about women's health, right? In particular, I wish our 18-year-old selves would have known. All right. That wraps up the quick fire. Those were incredible. And Erica, honey, where can we find you?
So you can find me on Instagram at Erica Ziel. I always say, reach out to me, ask me your questions there. I love the little voice thing. So sometimes I get more time and give people voice messages back. And then obviously my website, ericaziel.com, which is where you can find more information about what I do, my Core Connections podcast, and my programs.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining me today and really providing us a different way of thinking about our bodies and a different way of thinking about what is really an important part of woman's body, which we so often ignore because we're so in our head so often. So I appreciate the big message of like slowing it down and really focusing there, bringing attention to that area to start to heal it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mariza. This has been wonderful.